I'm Linda, 66, stirring soup in my Mesa kitchen on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Dan told me he was driving to Phoenix for another colleague's funeral. Just another sad Tuesday in retirement. Then my phone rang. Mom. Megan's voice came through FaceTime, bright with Hawaiian sunshine. Are you and Dad here in Maui? I swear I just saw him putting sunscreen on some woman by the pool. What are you talking about? I laughed, lifting my wooden spoon. He's at a funeral in Phoenix. You're seeing things. But then she flipped her camera. And there was my husband of 37 years, his hands sliding lotion across a young woman's shoulders while she whispered, Danny, in his ear. A nickname I'd never been allowed to use. In that moment, stirring soup in my empty kitchen, I realized the funeral story was just the beginning. The real death had been happening right under my nose. And today I was going to bury it myself. The morning light crawled through Linda Carter's kitchen window like honey through a sieve, painting golden rectangles that shifted and danced across the worn oak table. Where she had sorted mail every Tuesday for 37 years. The ritual had become as automatic as breathing bills in one pile, junk mail. In another, important documents carefully stacked according to urgency and deadline. At 66, Linda's fingers moved with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned that organization was armor against the chaos that life could unleash without warning. Each envelope received the same careful attention, even the grocery store circulars that promised savings. She would never need and vacation packages to destinations she would never see. But this morning, something disrupted the rhythm. Her thumb brushed against an envelope addressed to her husband Daniel in crisp medical billing font. The return address read, Southwest Stress Management Center, in letters that seemed to pulse with unspoken meaning. Linda held the envelope up to the window, trying to decipher its contents through the manila paper, but the text remained stubbornly hidden. Daniel hadn't mentioned any doctor visits. He was the kind of man who complained about medical appointments for weeks beforehand, treating every routine checkup like a personal assault on his dignity. When he had his colonoscopy 2 years ago, Linda had heard about it daily for a month before and after the procedure. This silence felt different, deliberate. Linda set the envelope aside and continued sorting, but her eyes kept drifting back to those medical billing letters. The coffee in her mug grew cold as she stared at the words, trying to decode the mystery of her husband's undisclosed healthcare needs. The sound of Daniel's footsteps on the hallway carpet made her quickly slide the envelope beneath a stack of grocery coupons. The motion felt guilty, conspiratorial, as if she were hiding evidence instead of simply organizing mail. Daniel entered the kitchen wearing the same navy suit he had worn to 3 different colleague funerals in the past 2 months. The fabric hung looser on his 70-year-old frame than it had last spring, creating creases and shadows that made him look older than she remembered. Or perhaps she was just noticing things she had chosen to ignore before. Morning, sweetheart, he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. The gesture felt hurried, mechanical, like checking an item off a daily list rather than expressing genuine affection. Linda looked up at him, searching his face for something she couldn't quite name. Love? Guilt? Recognition that she existed as more than a convenient presence in his morning routine? I need to leave in 20 minutes, Daniel continued, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the chrome coffee pot. Another memorial service in Tucson today. Linda watched him fuss with the knot, making tiny adjustments that served no practical purpose. That's the 3rd one this month, she said carefully. Your law firm must be having a terrible year. Old clients, Daniel muttered, his reflection fragmenting across the coffee pot's curved surface. You know how it is. When you reach our age, these things happen more often. There was something rehearsed about the way he delivered this explanation, as if he had practiced it in front of a mirror. The words came too easily, too smooth, lacking the rough edges of genuine emotion. His phone buzzed against the marble countertop like an angry wasp. Daniel's hand shot out to flip the device face down so quickly that Linda actually flinched. The swift, defensive motion stung her eyes like a physical slap, sudden and shocking in its intensity. Everything okay? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Just work, he said, not meeting her gaze. His eyes focused somewhere beyond her shoulder, as if she were an obstacle blocking his view of something more important. Always work. The phone buzzed again underneath his palm. Daniel pressed down harder, as if he could silence it through sheer force of will. The action struck Linda as oddly desperate, like a man trying to hold back flood waters with his bare hands. After Daniel left, the kitchen felt too quiet. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune. The wall clock ticked with the persistence of a dripping faucet, each second falling into the silence like a stone into still water. Linda sat alone at the table where they had shared thousands of morning conversations, surrounded by the detritus of a life lived in careful routine. She pulled open the drawer where she kept their important papers, Medicare cards arranged chronologically, pill organizers labeled with the days of the week in her neat handwriting, property tax notices, and their joint bank statements. Everything organized with the precision of a woman who understood that paperwork was the skeleton that held a retirement together. She spread the most recent bank statement across the table like a map to territory she wasn't sure she wanted to explore. Her eyes scanned the familiar charges: grocery store, gas station, the monthly fee for Daniel's golf club membership that stretched their budget, but which he insisted helped his professional networking. Then her vision snagged on something that made her stomach perform a slow, nauseating flip. Honolulu Hotel Resort, $463. Linda stared at the line item until the numbers seemed to blur and swim on the page. $463. Charged to their joint credit card on a date that corresponded with one of Daniel's alleged funeral trips. She remembered asking him about the charge 2 weeks ago. Daniel had waved it away with the same dismissive gesture he used when explaining why his law practice wasn't bringing in as much money as it used to. Credit card fraud, he had said with convincing concern. These scammers are getting more sophisticated. I'll call the bank tomorrow and get it straightened out. But the charge was still there. Still unexplained. Still stealing $400 from their carefully managed retirement budget like a thief in the night. Linda picked up her phone and dialed Megan's number in Seattle, needing to hear her daughter's voice like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. The call connected after 3 rings, filled with the cheerful chaos of a busy household. "Hi Mom," Megan's voice carried the gentle exhaustion of a 34-year-old working mother juggling career and family. "How's the desert treating you today?" "Oh, you know. Same as always." Linda forced brightness into her voice, a skill she had perfected during Daniel's previous financial disasters. "How's little Emma? Still keeping you up at night?" "She's getting better. Jason thinks she might actually be sleeping through the night more often now." "We're cautiously optimistic." Megan paused, and Linda could hear the sound of a toddler babbling in the background. "Are you okay? You sound, I don't know, distracted." Linda glanced at the bank statement spread across her table. The Honolulu charge seemed to pulse like a neon sign advertising betrayal. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about baby names for when the next grandchild comes along." They talked for 15 more minutes about preschool applications and Seattle rain. And whether Megan should try for a promotion at the marketing firm where she worked. Normal mother-daughter conversation that usually soothed Linda's nerves like a gentle balm. But today, even Megan's laughter couldn't quiet the knot forming in her chest, growing tighter with each passing moment. After she hung up, Linda walked through their modest ranch house in Mesa like a stranger touring someone else's life. The living room where Daniel used to read legal briefs while she watched cooking shows, both of them comfortable in their separate but parallel activities. The hallway lined with framed photos of family vacations and birthday celebrations, documenting decades of shared history. Their bedroom with the king-sized bed they had bought during better financial times, when Daniel's law practice was thriving and the future seemed secure. Everything looked exactly the same as it had for years. The same furniture in the same positions, the same photographs capturing the same smiling faces. Yet something fundamental had shifted, like furniture moved just inches from its proper place. The familiar had become foreign, tinged with suspicion and doubt. Linda paused in front of their wedding photograph, taken 37 years ago. When they were both young and convinced that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. Daniel's face in the picture was smooth and confident, free from the lines that worry and disappointment had carved over the decades. Her own face glowed with the kind of trust that only came from never having been betrayed. She wondered when they had stopped being those people. That evening, Daniel returned home carrying the scent of unfamiliar aftershave that hit Linda like a physical blow. The smell was sharp, hotel-like, nothing like the Old Spice he had worn for as long as she could remember. When she hugged him at the door, the foreign fragrance made her step back involuntarily, as if her body recognized a threat before her mind could process it. "How was the service?" she asked, studying his face for signs of genuine grief. "Sad," he said, loosening his tie with movements that seemed too practiced, too smooth. Frank Morrison. Worked with him on a few cases in the 80s. Heart attack at 68. His wife is absolutely devastated. Linda nodded, but something about the way he recited these details felt rehearsed, like dialogue from a play he had practiced but didn't quite believe. The specifics came too easily, too complete, lacking the fumbling uncertainty of real memory. "I think I'll take a shower," Daniel said, already moving toward the hallway. Long day. She watched him disappear down the corridor, his shoulders carrying a weight that seemed different from the ordinary tiredness of grief. This was something heavier, more secretive, like a man carrying stolen goods. The bathroom door closed with a soft click that echoed through the house like a period ending a sentence. Linda returned to the kitchen and pulled out the bank statement again, spreading it across the table like evidence in a trial. She ran her finger along the line items, tracing their financial life with the methodical precision of an accountant: electric bill, water bill, insurance payments. The necessities of a retirement lived within careful boundaries. And then that charge. Honolulu Hotel Resort. $463. She opened her laptop and navigated to the hotel's website, each click of the mouse feeling like a step deeper into territory she wasn't prepared to explore. Palm trees and infinity pools filled her screen in brilliant tropical colors. Couples in white robes sipped champagne on private balconies overlooking water so blue it looked artificial. Room rates starting at $400 per night. The photographs showed exactly the kind of luxury that she and Daniel couldn't afford on their retirement income. The kind of place she had dreamed about visiting someday, when his legal practice recovered. Or when they finally managed to save enough for one extravagant vacation before they became too old to travel. But Daniel had never mentioned wanting to go to Hawaii. In fact, he complained constantly about the heat in Arizona, claiming that anything more tropical would be unbearable. He had always dismissed vacation destinations as overpriced tourist traps designed to separate retirees from their life savings. Linda closed the laptop and stared at her reflection in the dark window above the kitchen sink. A 66-year-old woman with silver hair and worry lines, married to a man whose aftershave now smelled like someone else's life. Someone else's choices, someone else's secrets. She prepared for bed with movements that felt automatic, disconnected from conscious thought. Brushing her teeth while staring at her reflection, wondering when the woman in the mirror had started looking so tired, so defeated. Changing into pajamas that felt foreign against her skin, as if her own clothes belonged to someone else. The swamp cooler rattled against the wall, fighting the desert heat that never seemed to break, even at night. She had grown used to the sound over the years, finding comfort in its mechanical persistence. It was the rhythm of home, of the life they had built together through law school and lean times and Daniel's failed investments and slow recoveries. But tonight, lying in bed beside her husband of 37 years, Linda felt the space between them expanding like a chasm opening in the earth. Daniel's breathing was steady, peaceful, untroubled. The breathing of a man with nothing to hide, or perhaps of a man who had become so comfortable with deception that even sleep brought no guilt. She stared at the ceiling, counting the familiar water stains that had appeared after last year's monsoon rains. Patterns she had memorized during countless sleepless nights, but which tonight seemed to form new shapes, new meanings, like tea leaves revealing an unwelcome fortune. Somewhere in the darkness, a clock was ticking, not just marking time, but counting something down. Something that felt fragile and precious and already broken beyond repair. When Daniel rolled over in his sleep, his arm brushed against hers with the careless intimacy of long marriage. His skin was warm, familiar, belonging to the man who had shared her bed and her dreams and her fears for most of her adult life. But his aftershave still carried the sharp, clean scent of hotel soap. Of luxury rooms and Egyptian cotton sheets and a life that didn't include the woman lying beside him. Wondering when her husband's touch had started feeling like a stranger's caress. Linda closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time Daniel had looked at her with genuine affection. The last time his smile had reached his eyes when he spoke to her. But the memories felt distant, faded, like photographs left too long in sunlight. The swamp cooler continued its mechanical breathing, marking time in a house where two people slept side by side while living increasingly separate lives. And in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next, Linda felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. It was the first crack in a foundation that had taken 37 years to build. Small at first, barely noticeable, but growing wider with each passing moment until it threatened to split her world completely in half. 3 weeks crawled by with the sluggish persistence of desert heat, each day bringing Linda closer to a reckoning she wasn't sure she wanted to face. She had been avoiding their monthly financial ritual, telling herself that ignorance might somehow make the Honolulu charge vanish like a mirage on hot asphalt. But Tuesday evening arrived with its relentless demands, dragging behind it the weight of bills that needed paying and numbers that demanded reconciliation. Life had a way of insisting on truth, regardless of how much easier lies might be to swallow. Linda sat at the kitchen table beneath the harsh fluorescent light that buzzed like a dying insect overhead. The sound had never bothered her before, but tonight it felt like an accusation. A constant reminder that something in her carefully ordered world was fundamentally broken. She opened their joint checking account on her laptop screen and watched the familiar parade of charges load with agonizing slowness. Electric company, water department, Daniel's prescription refills for the heart medication that kept him alive and the blood pressure pills that kept him functional. The monthly payment on their used Honda that still had 18 months of financing left, stretching their retirement budget. Like an elastic band pulled to its breaking point. Then her breath caught in her throat like a fishbone, sharp and choking. A new line item glowed at the top of the statement: Alaska Airlines, round-trip PHX to OG. $847. Purchased on a Saturday morning while Daniel was supposedly driving 2 hours south to attend Frank Morrison's memorial service in Tucson. Phoenix to Maui, not Phoenix to Tucson. Linda stared at the screen until her eyes began to water, hoping the text would rearrange itself into something less damning. But the numbers remained stubborn as gravestones, marking the death of whatever trust she had left in the man who shared her bed and her social security benefits. She refreshed the browser page with the desperate hope of a gambler pulling a slot machine lever one more time. The entry remained bold and unforgiving. $847. A round-trip ticket to paradise, purchased while she believed her husband was mourning a dead colleague. Somewhere down the block, Mrs. Patterson's ancient beagle started barking at a delivery truck with the kind of righteous indignation that Linda suddenly understood on a cellular level. The sound felt sharp and accusatory, like the universe itself pointing out the lies that had been growing in her marriage like cancer. Linda printed the bank statement with hands that trembled slightly, watching the paper emerge from their ancient printer with deliberate slowness. She spread it beside their monthly budget worksheet, a document that represented decades of careful planning and small sacrifices. Every dollar had a purpose in their retirement ecosystem. Groceries $300, carefully allocated across 4 weeks of meals planned around store sales and seasonal produce. Utilities $215, managed through aggressive conservation and off-peak usage. Daniel's medication $60 after Medicare coverage, a reminder of mortality that grew more expensive each year. $800 for airline tickets represented a month's worth of grocery money. 2 months of utility payments, or 13 months of prescription costs. It was money that required discussion, planning, the kind of joint decision-making that defined partnership. But this purchase had been made in secret, hidden like contraband in the dark spaces of their shared financial life. The front door clicked open with the sound of metal against metal, followed by Daniel's footsteps echoing across the hardwood entryway. Each footfall seemed to count down the seconds until confrontation, measuring the distance between ignorance and knowledge. "Evening, sweetheart," he called from the hallway, his voice carrying the artificial cheer of a man trying too hard to sound normal. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was brutal coming back from Phoenix." Phoenix, not Tucson. The word hung in the air like smoke, acrid and revealing. Linda quickly minimized the laptop screen but left the printed statement face down beside her coffee mug, positioned like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. "How did the deposition go?" she asked, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "Fine. Routine." Daniel entered the kitchen and tossed his brown leather wallet onto the counter with more force than the gesture required. The sound was sharp, final, like a gavel ending a trial. A white plastic rectangle slipped out of the wallet and clattered across the tile floor with the sound of guilty secrets breaking free. Linda bent to retrieve it, her movements careful and deliberate. A hotel keycard. Grand Wailea Resort, Maui. The plastic was still crisp, recently used, carrying the faint scent of tropical air and expensive soap. "I thought you said you drove to Tucson today," Linda said, holding up the keycard between them like evidence in a courtroom. "Since when do funeral homes issue resort amenities?" Daniel's laugh erupted too quickly, too loudly, like a car engine turning over on a cold morning. The sound was wrong, mechanical, lacking any genuine humor. "Oh, that. Jim Patterson gave it to me last week. His daughter works at a hotel chain. Thought maybe we'd want to plan a vacation someday." He snatched the keycard from her hand with movements that were too fast, too desperate, and flicked it into the trash can beneath the sink. The lid slammed shut with metallic finality, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a door closing forever. Linda flinched at the violence of the gesture. In 37 years of marriage, Daniel had never been careless with money or dismissive about expenses. Every purchase used to come with explanations, justifications, long conversations about whether they could afford it, and whether it aligned with their long-term goals. Now he was throwing away hotel keycards like tissue paper, as if luxury accommodations were so common in their life that they merited no discussion. "Daniel," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." But he was already moving toward the hallway, his hands working at his tie with the urgent efficiency of a man trying to escape. "I'm exhausted, honey. These court days drain me more than they used to. Can we talk tomorrow?" The bathroom door closed before she could answer, the soft click reverberating through the house like a starting gun. Linda sat alone in the kitchen that suddenly felt too large, too empty. Surrounded by the evidence of a life built on shared assumptions that were crumbling like ancient mortar. She pulled the printed bank statement from beneath her coffee mug and stared at the airline charge until the numbers seemed to burn themselves into her retinas. Phoenix to Maui, $847. The same weekend Frank Morrison supposedly died. She opened her laptop again and searched for Frank Morrison's obituary with the methodical thoroughness of a detective investigating a crime. Tucson newspapers yielded nothing. Phoenix newspapers turned up no recent deaths in Daniel's legal network. Online memorial sites revealed no Frank Morrison, no funeral services that weekend in Tucson or anywhere else in Arizona. The search results glowed on her screen like accusations. No Frank Morrison. No funeral. No colleague's tragic death requiring Daniel's presence at a memorial service 2 hours south of their home. Just lies, piled upon lies, reaching toward the ceiling like a tower of deception that threatened to topple and crush everything beneath it. The television in the living room was still playing the local evening news from earlier, forgotten in the chaos of discovery. A reporter was interviewing elderly fraud victims, warning seniors to protect their bank accounts, their trust. Their life savings from scammers who looked just like family members, who spoke the language of love while picking pockets with practiced efficiency. Maybe I'm just becoming paranoid, Linda told herself, the thought feeling hollow and unconvincing even in her own mind. Maybe there's a simple explanation for everything. But the Maui charge glowed on her screen like a truth refusing to stay buried. $847. A round-trip ticket to paradise, purchased while she believed her husband was mourning the dead. The phone buzzed against the counter with a text message from an unknown number. Linda's heart lurched, imagining more evidence of Daniel's secret life materializing like ghosts. But when she checked the screen, it was just a spam message about Medicare supplements. As if the universe were mocking her concerns about healthcare costs while her husband spent their retirement money on tropical getaways. When Daniel emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, Linda was sitting at the kitchen table. With the bank statement spread in front of her like a map to territory she never wanted to explore. The paper seemed to glow under the fluorescent light, every line item a potential landmine in the battlefield their marriage had become. "Explain this," she said, pointing to the airline charge with a finger that trembled slightly. Daniel glanced at the paper and folded it in half without reading the details, his movements quick and dismissive. He set it on top of their Medicare Part D prescription brochures. As if burying it beneath healthcare paperwork could make the charge disappear through some kind of administrative magic. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice carrying an edge she hadn't heard in years. It was the tone he used to reserve for opposing lawyers who pushed too hard during depositions, sharp enough to cut glass. "Probably another billing error. Identity theft is everywhere these days. They're getting more sophisticated. $800 isn't a billing error, Daniel. It's a round-trip ticket to Hawaii." The words hung between them like a blade suspended by thread. Daniel's face shifted through several expressions: surprise, annoyance, calculation, and finally settling on a mask of wounded innocence that looked rehearsed. "I said I'll handle it." His voice had grown colder, more distant, as if he were speaking to a stranger rather than the woman who had shared his life for nearly 4 decades. "These scammers target seniors specifically. They know we're more trusting, more vulnerable." The irony was so sharp Linda could taste it like blood in her mouth. He was warning her about scammers while systematically stealing from their joint account. Describing the vulnerabilities of seniors while exploiting her trust with surgical precision. "When?" she asked. "When exactly will you handle it?" "Tomorrow. I'll call the bank first thing in the morning." But even as he spoke, Daniel's eyes were focused somewhere beyond her shoulder, as if the conversation were already over in his mind. He was planning his escape even while making promises he had no intention of keeping. That night, Linda waited until Daniel's breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep before she moved. She slipped out of bed with the silent efficiency of a burglar in her own home. Retrieving the bank statement from the kitchen table where Daniel had tried to bury it beneath Medicare brochures. She carried it to their bedroom closet and pulled out a manila folder she had never used before. One that had been waiting empty in their filing system for years. On the front, she wrote in careful block letters with a pen that felt heavy as a weapon just in case. The words looked stark and final under the closet's overhead bulb, like an epitaph for a marriage that might already be dead. Inside the folder, she placed the bank statement next to their reverse mortgage offer that had arrived the previous month. The offer they had discussed briefly over breakfast, then dismissed because they weren't desperate enough to sacrifice their home equity. Not yet. But tonight, looking at $800 worth of secret airline tickets, Linda realized that desperation might arrive sooner than expected. The reverse mortgage papers suddenly looked less like a last resort and more like a life preserver thrown to a drowning woman. She added the hotel keycard, retrieved from the kitchen trash after Daniel had fallen asleep. The plastic rectangle felt light in her hand, almost weightless, but it carried the weight of betrayal like lead. She slid the folder beneath her side of the mattress, tucked between the box spring and the bedroom wall where Daniel would never think to look. The hiding place felt shameful and necessary, like the secret account she had opened years ago to save money for emergencies. For the first time in their marriage, she was preparing for a future that might not include the man sleeping beside her. A future where his secrets would become evidence, where her careful record-keeping would become the foundation of survival rather than partnership. The swamp cooler rattled against the wall, fighting the desert heat that never seemed to break completely. The mechanical breathing had once been comforting, a sign of home and safety and the life they had built together through good times and bad. But tonight, the sound felt different. Not like the rhythm of home, but like a countdown timer marking the end of something precious that Linda was only now realizing she had already lost. Each rattle was a second passing, each mechanical breath a moment closer to a reckoning that felt as inevitable as sunrise. She lay in the darkness beside her husband of 37 years, listening to him breathe the peaceful sleep of either innocence or practiced deception. His arm was draped across her side of the bed. A gesture that had once felt protective and loving but now felt possessive, territorial, like a claim on property he was already planning to abandon. Linda closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time Daniel had touched her with genuine affection rather than automatic habit. But the memories felt distant, buried beneath layers of routine and disappointment. and the gradual erosion of intimacy that seemed to happen so slowly she had never noticed it disappearing. In the space between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next, she felt something fundamental shift in her chest. It was the sound of a foundation cracking, small fissures spreading through stone that had seemed solid for decades. Tomorrow, she would pretend that everything was normal. She would make coffee and sort mail and ask about Daniel's day with the same careful attention she had always paid to their shared life. But tonight, in the darkness of their bedroom, Linda Carter began the slow, painful process of learning to be alone while lying next to someone who was already gone. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of relentless desert sunshine that made the air shimmer like water over hot asphalt. Linda stood at her kitchen stove, watching oatmeal bubble and foam over the edges of the saucepan in slow-motion disaster. The cereal had erupted like a science experiment gone wrong, spreading across the burner in thick white streams that crusted against the metal and filled the kitchen with the acrid smell of burnt breakfast and neglect. She turned off the heat but left the mess untouched, her attention captured by something more urgent than domestic disasters. The television in the adjoining living room painted the screen with impossibly blue water and palm trees that swayed in tropical breezes, their fronds moving with hypnotic rhythm. Hawaii looked like a postcard from someone else's life, a fantasy destination that existed somewhere between dreams and bankruptcy. Linda had always imagined visiting the islands someday, when Daniel's legal practice stabilized and their retirement savings grew thick enough to absorb such luxury. The travel commercials made it look effortless, couples walking hand in hand on pristine beaches, sipping drinks with little umbrellas, discovering romance in paradise. The commercial ended, replaced by a cooking show featuring a chef who promised to teach viewers how to make restaurant-quality meals on a retirement budget. Linda usually found these programs comforting, proof that financial limitations didn't have to mean culinary deprivation. But today the cheerful instructions felt like noise, meaningless chatter designed to fill silence that demanded more serious contemplation. Her phone buzzed against the granite countertop with the persistence of a mosquito seeking blood. A video call from Megan, the timing so perfect it felt like divine intervention. Linda accepted the call and found herself looking at her daughter's face, framed by brilliant sunlight and the distant sound of ocean waves that seemed to come from another planet entirely. Behind Megan, she could see Jason adjusting a beach umbrella, with the careful attention of a man who had paid good money for vacation time and intended to maximize every moment. The background was stunning white sand stretching toward water so clear it looked artificially enhanced. Other vacationers moved across the beach like figures in a living postcard, spreading colorful towels and applying sunscreen with the unhurried movements of people who had nowhere else to be. "Mom, look how gorgeous it is here," Megan said, flipping her phone's camera toward the coastline with obvious pride. "The water is so clear you can see straight to the bottom. There are fish swimming around like it's a giant aquarium." Linda forced a smile that felt like lifting weights. The tropical paradise on her phone screen seemed to mock her kitchen disaster, the contrast between Megan's vacation bliss and her own domestic chaos feeling sharp enough to cut. "It looks beautiful, sweetheart. You picked the perfect time for a vacation." Jason found this amazing little resort through some travel website. Not too touristy, not too expensive. The kind of place where you can actually relax instead of fighting crowds. Megan paused, her voice taking on the dreamy quality of someone drunk on sunshine and ocean air. "You and Dad should really come here someday. Maybe for your anniversary? You've been talking about taking a big trip for years." The word, Dad, stuck in Linda's throat like a splinter. 2 months ago, she would have immediately started planning such a trip, pulling out her notebook to calculate how many months they'd need to save for flights and hotel rooms. She would have researched restaurants and excursions, building detailed itineraries with the thoroughness of a military campaign. Now the suggestion felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of dreams that had been poisoned by deception. "Maybe someday," Linda managed, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears. "Right now we're just focused on getting through the summer heat." Megan turned the camera back to her own face, and Linda could see concern creeping into her daughter's expression like clouds gathering on a clear horizon. "Are you okay? You look tired, more tired than usual." "I'm fine, just haven't had my coffee yet." Linda glanced at the burnt oatmeal congealing on her stovetop, evidence of a morning that had started badly and seemed determined to get worse. Tell me about the resort. What's it like? Incredible. Like something out of a magazine, but real. The pool area has these infinity edges that make it look like the water just disappears into the ocean. And the people here are so friendly. Everyone's just relaxing and enjoying themselves. Megan shifted the phone again, panning across rows of lounge chairs and colorful umbrellas arranged with mathematical precision. Jason's taking video of everything so you can see what we're talking about when we get home. The camera swept past couples reading books, families building elaborate sandcastles near the water's edge. Elderly tourists sipping drinks from tall glasses that caught the sunlight like prisms. A typical vacation scene that Linda had dreamed about experiencing with Daniel once his legal practice recovered. And their retirement funds grew stable enough to absorb such indulgence. Those dreams felt impossibly naive now, like wishes made by a child who didn't understand how the world actually worked. The weather's been perfect too, Megan continued, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone determined to share every detail of paradise. Not too hot, just this perfect breeze that makes everything feel like. Her voice stopped abruptly, cut off by something that had caught her attention beyond the camera's view. Mom, wait, do you see that guy under the blue umbrella? The one with the gray hair? Linda squinted at her phone screen, trying to focus on the distant figures that moved across the beach like ants viewed from an airplane. In the background of Megan's call, beneath a navy blue beach umbrella that stood out against the white sand like a flag, a man leaned over a younger woman who was lying face down on a striped towel. His hands moved slowly across her bare shoulders, spreading white sunscreen lotion in careful, methodical circles. The motion was intimate, protective, the kind of gesture that spoke of comfort and familiarity between lovers. At first, Linda told herself it was just another tourist helping his wife avoid sunburn. Couples did that for each other all the time. It was normal, considerate behavior that required no explanation beyond simple human kindness. But then the man tilted his head to examine his work, and Linda's heart stopped beating for several seconds before resuming with painful intensity. She recognized that particular slope of shoulders, the way he held his left arm slightly higher than his right, a habit he had developed after injuring it in a golf accident 5 years ago. The angle of his neck when he concentrated on detailed tasks. The methodical way he approached even simple activities with the precision of a man who had spent decades reviewing legal documents. Megan, Linda whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own pulse thundering in her ears. Sweetheart, that's your father. What? Megan's voice cracked like ice breaking under pressure. Mom, that can't be Dad. Dad's supposed to be at another funeral today. In Phoenix this time. He told you that, right? But even as she spoke, both women watched the gray-haired man lean closer to the young woman on the towel. The woman laughed and rolled onto her side, placing her hand on the man's thigh in a gesture that was intimate. Familiar, comfortable in the way that only came from repetition. The sound of her laughter carried clearly across the beach to where Megan stood with her phone. Amplified by the ocean air and the perfect acoustics of paradise. You missed a spot, babe, the woman said, her voice light and teasing. Carrying the kind of endearment that suggested countless previous conversations, shared jokes, inside references that excluded everyone else in the world. The word, babe, hit Linda like a physical blow, sharp and devastating in its casual intimacy. She had never called Daniel, babe, in 37 years of marriage. He had always preferred formal names, considering nicknames unprofessional and slightly embarrassing. But this woman who couldn't be older than 30 got to call him babe, while wearing a bikini that probably cost more than Linda spent on clothing in 6 months. Linda watched her husband of 37 years drag his lotion-slicked hand down the side of a woman young enough to be their daughter. A woman who called him babe, with the casual affection of someone who had said it many times before, in many different circumstances. Possibly in hotel rooms that cost $400 per night. Linda's phone nearly slipped from her trembling grip. The device felt suddenly heavy, unwieldy, as if the weight of what she was seeing had somehow transferred through the screen and into the physical world. Mom, Megan said, her own voice shaking with the kind of disbelief that comes from watching your worldview collapse in real time. Please tell me this is some kind of terrible mistake. Please tell me that's not really Dad. But the woman was sitting up now, leaning against Daniel's shoulder while he wrapped a resort towel around her like a protective embrace. She kissed his cheek with casual affection, leaving a trace of lip gloss on his skin that caught the tropical sunlight and glittered like evidence. Linda had seen Daniel apply sunscreen 1,000 times during their marriage. She knew the methodical way he worked, starting at the shoulders and moving down in careful sections to ensure complete coverage. She knew how he held his head when he was trying not to miss any spots, the way he pursed his lips in concentration. This was her husband. There was no mistake, no doppelganger, no case of mistaken identity. This was Daniel Carter, 70 years old, father of 2, grandfather of 1, applying sunscreen. To a woman who looked like she should be someone's daughter rather than someone's mistress. Jason, Megan called off camera, her voice high and strained. Come here, look at this. Tell me I'm not losing my mind. Linda heard Jason's voice in the background, followed by the crunch of sand as he moved closer to where Megan was standing. The sound was sharp and immediate, transmitted through the phone with startling clarity. Holy shit, Jason said, then immediately caught himself. Sorry, Linda, but that really looks like. I know what it looks like, Linda said, her voice sounding strange and distant, as if it were coming from someone else's throat. The call dropped for several seconds, leaving Linda staring at a blank screen that reflected her own face like a funhouse mirror. When the connection restored, Megan's face was flushed and her breathing was rapid, like she had been running. Mom, we moved closer. We're behind some palm trees now where they can't see us. Megan's voice carried the excitement of a spy conducting surveillance, mixed with the horror of a daughter discovering her father's betrayal. Dad just wrapped that towel around her shoulders and they're walking toward the cafe. They're holding hands. Linda watched through her daughter's phone as Daniel and the young woman strolled across the sand like honeymooners on their first day in paradise. Daniel's free hand rested protectively on the small of the woman's back, a gesture Linda recognized from their own courtship 40 years ago. She leaned into him with the comfortable intimacy of someone who had done this many times before. In many different locations, possibly in many different resort towns, they moved with the easy synchronization of a couple who knew each other's rhythms. Who had shared enough time together to develop the unconscious choreography of intimacy. Their steps matched perfectly, their conversation was animated, their body language spoke of comfort and familiarity and the kind of sexual chemistry that Linda hadn't experienced with Daniel in years. What's her name? Linda asked, her voice sounding remarkably calm considering that her world was ending in real time. I heard him call her Sabrina when they were ordering drinks earlier. She's been calling him Danny all morning. Danny. Nobody called him Danny. Linda had tried it exactly once, during their second date in 1986, and Daniel had politely but firmly requested that she use his full name instead. Daniel sounds more professional, he had explained with the kind of gentle correction that suggested the topic wasn't open for negotiation. More serious. But this 30-year-old girl in a designer bikini got to call him Danny while sipping champagne on a beach that Linda had never seen except in commercials and her daughter's phone screen. Should I confront him? Megan asked, her voice carrying the kind of barely controlled rage that comes from watching someone you love being betrayed in public. Should I walk up to their table and ask him what the hell he's doing? Linda's first instinct was primal and violent. She wanted to tell Megan to march up to that table, grab the woman by her perfectly styled hair, and force Daniel to explain himself in front of everyone on that beach. She wanted him to feel humiliation as sharp and public as the betrayal he had just inflicted on her. She wanted to see his face when he realized that his secret life had been discovered, that his lies had been exposed. That his careful deception had crumbled like sand in the wind. But then she looked at her daughter's face on the phone screen. Megan was 34 years old, married, successful, a mother herself. But in that moment she looked like a child who had just watched her world split in half, a little girl whose daddy had suddenly become a stranger. You do not go alone, Linda said firmly, her voice carrying the kind of maternal authority that had guided Megan through childhood crises. You stay where people can see you, and you do not approach them without Jason right beside you. If a war starts today, I'm fighting it with you, not watching you fight it by yourself. What do you want us to do? Linda looked around her kitchen. The burnt oatmeal on the stove. The bank statements scattered across her table like evidence in a crime scene. The Medicare brochures and reverse mortgage offers that represented the careful boundaries of their retirement life. All of it suddenly felt like props in a play she had been unknowingly performing for months, maybe years. While she worried about grocery budgets and prescription costs and whether they could afford to repair the swamp cooler before summer, Daniel had been financing secret trips to paradise with women young enough to be their daughter. While she calculated how to stretch their Social Security payments across monthly expenses, he had been spending $800 on airline tickets to rendezvous with a mistress who called him Danny and kissed his cheek in public. "Mom?" Megan's voice brought her back to the phone, back to the reality of discovering betrayal through a video call from paradise. "I want you to take pictures," Linda said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want you to record video if you can do it without them noticing. And then I want you to find out what hotel they're staying at. Are you coming here?" Linda walked to the drawer where she kept their important papers and pulled out her passport. The document felt heavy in her hand, weighted with the gravity of decisions that would change everything. She opened her purse and checked her credit card balance on her phone, scrolling through the account she had been building in secret for months. Emergency money, car repair money, medical crisis money. This qualified as an emergency. "You crossed an ocean to betray me," Linda said, speaking more to herself than to Megan but meaning every word with the force of a vow. "Now I'll cross it to hear you say it out loud." She ended the call and stood in her silent kitchen, surrounded by the debris of a normal morning that had just revealed itself to be the end of her marriage. The travel commercial had returned to the television, promising tropical adventures and romantic getaways for couples looking to rekindle their love. The irony felt sharp enough to draw blood. Linda turned off the TV and began making a list of what she needed to pack for the flight that would either save her marriage or end it forever. But deep in her heart, in the place where hope had lived for 37 years, she already knew which outcome was more likely. The burnt oatmeal continued to congeal on the stove, filling the kitchen with the smell of things that couldn't be saved. 14 hours later, Linda stepped out of the Kahului airport shuttle into air so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through warm honey. The tropical heat pressed against her skin with the weight of a physical presence. Nothing like the dry desert warmth that baked Mesa into submission every summer. This was different, alive, breathing, heavy with the scent of flowers and ocean salt and the kind of moisture that made everything feel saturated with life. Palm trees swayed overhead like giant fans trying to stir the soupy air, their fronds rustling with a sound that reminded Linda of pages turning in a book. The distant crash of waves mixed with tourist chatter in a dozen languages, creating a symphony of vacation bliss that felt surreal given the circumstances that had brought her here. She had never imagined her first trip to Hawaii would happen like this alone. Desperate, armed with credit card statements and a daughter's surveillance reports. This should have been a romantic getaway with Daniel. The kind of second honeymoon they had discussed during better times when his legal practice was thriving and their future seemed secure. Instead, she was here to confront the man who had been living a double life while she balanced checkbooks and worried about Medicare premiums. Following Megan's detailed text directions, Linda took a taxi through landscapes that looked like screensavers come to life. Rolling hills covered in vegetation so green it seemed artificial. Golf courses manicured to impossible perfection. Resort driveways lined with flowers that bloomed in colors she had never seen in the desert. The taxi driver, a cheerful local man who seemed genuinely happy to be alive on such a beautiful day, kept up a steady stream of commentary about the weather, the tourists, and the best places to eat poke. Linda nodded at appropriate intervals, but her attention was focused on the approaching confrontation. That would either explode her marriage completely or somehow lead to reconciliation. She wasn't sure which outcome she preferred. The beachside cafe where Megan had been conducting surveillance for the past 4 hours was even more beautiful than the website photos had suggested. White sand stretched toward water so blue it looked like liquid sapphire. Couples strolled hand in hand along the shoreline while families built elaborate sandcastles near the water's edge. Children shrieked with delight as gentle waves chased their feet across the sand. It looked like paradise, which made what she was about to do feel like desecration of something sacred. Linda spotted Megan and Jason near a cluster of palm trees, partially hidden behind a thatched roof bar where tourists sipped colorful drinks and laughed with the carefree abandon of people on vacation. Megan's face was flushed with a combination of anger and excitement, like a warrior preparing for battle. "They're still at the same table," Megan whispered as Linda reached them, her voice carrying the intensity of a reconnaissance briefing. "They've been there for over an hour. Dad ordered them both lobster rolls and champagne. The expensive kind. Lobster rolls and champagne." Linda calculated the cost automatically, a habit ingrained by decades of careful budgeting. $60, maybe $70 with tip and tax. More than she typically spent on groceries for an entire week, certainly more than they could afford to spend casually on lunch. But here was her husband of 37 years, treating his mistress to luxury meals, while Linda clipped coupons and bought generic medications to stretch their fixed income. "What's her name again?" Linda asked, needing to put a label on the woman who had helped destroy her marriage. "Sabrina." She called him Danny when the waiter came over to refill their champagne glasses. Megan's voice carried the kind of disgust usually reserved for insects found in food. "She acts like she owns him. Touches his arm when she talks, feeds him bites of her food, laughs at everything he says like he's the most fascinating man in the world." Danny. The name felt like a betrayal in itself. Linda had been married to Daniel for 37 years, but this woman got to call him by the nickname he had never allowed anyone else to use. "There's something else," Jason said, stepping closer to Linda with the careful movements of a man delivering bad news. "Sabrina noticed us taking pictures about 10 minutes ago. She pointed her phone our way and said something to your husband. Now she looks pissed, and they're having some kind of argument." As if summoned by his words, raised voices erupted from the direction of the cafe. A young woman in a yellow sundress had stood up from her table and was gesticulating wildly while speaking in a voice loud enough to carry across the sand. "I told you someone was watching us," Sabrina was saying, her voice sharp with accusation and fear. "I told you this was a bad idea. You said your wife never left Arizona." Daniel grabbed her wrist, trying to calm her down with the practiced efficiency of a lawyer managing a difficult client. But Sabrina pulled away from his touch and gathered her designer beach bag with movements that spoke of someone preparing to flee. "You promised me she didn't even know your travel schedule," Sabrina continued, her voice growing shriller with each word. "You said she was practically an invalid, that she barely paid attention to anything except her medical problems." Other diners were starting to stare now, their tropical vacation temporarily interrupted by the unfolding drama. Hotel staff hovered nearby, clearly torn between allowing guests their privacy and preventing a scene that might disturb other patrons. Megan had tried to wait for Linda's arrival, just as Linda had begged her to do over the phone. But the moment Sabrina noticed the surveillance, the scene had exploded beyond anyone's control. Now they were watching a public confrontation that was already too late to prevent or manage. "She knows we're here," Megan said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "What do we do now?" Linda had prayed during the entire flight from Phoenix that she would arrive to find some terrible misunderstanding. Maybe the gray-haired man was Daniel's doppelganger, a cruel case of mistaken identity that would lead to embarrassed apologies and relieved laughter. Maybe her eyes had played tricks on her through the pixelated video call, creating betrayal where none existed. But when Daniel turned around to scan the beach, his face carried the same expression of trapped panic. She had seen the day he nearly lost their house in the real estate scam of 2008. The look of a man who had been caught doing something he could never explain away, never rationalize, never reduce to a simple misunderstanding. His eyes found hers across 30 yards of white sand, and Linda watched recognition dawn on his face like sunrise over a disaster. For just a moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked completely, revealing the frightened old man beneath the facade of confident virility. Linda walked out from behind the palm trees and onto the sand, her sandals sinking slightly with each step. The unstable footing made her feel unsteady, but she kept walking with the determination of a woman who had come too far to turn back now. Each step brought her closer to the end of everything she had believed about her marriage, her husband, herself. But she kept walking, crossing the beach like a soldier advancing toward enemy lines. Who did you bury this weekend, Dan? Linda asked when she reached the cafe table. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, as if she were asking about the weather or requesting directions to the restroom. But the question hit Daniel like a physical blow. His face went white, then red, then white again as he struggled to process the impossibility of his wife's presence in his secret paradise. Sabrina spun around to face the older woman who had seemingly materialized from nowhere like an avenging angel. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the panic in her eyes. The sudden understanding that her tropical fantasy was about to become a very public nightmare. Who the hell are you? Sabrina demanded, her voice carrying the kind of outrage usually reserved for someone whose reservation has been given away. I'm his wife, Linda said simply, as if those 3 words could encompass 37 years of shared history, accumulated trust, and systematic betrayal. The declaration hit Sabrina like a slap. Her perfectly manicured finger sliced through the humid air toward Linda, trembling with a combination of shock and fury. You're his wife? He told me you were practically bedridden. That you barely left the house anymore because of your health problems. Sabrina's voice climbed toward hysteria with each word. He said you had some kind of early dementia. That you couldn't even balance a checkbook anymore because your mind was going. The words felt like knives finding their target with surgical precision. Linda felt her knees go weak, not just from the revelation of Daniel's infidelity, but from the specific cruelty of how he had described her to justify his betrayal. Not only had Daniel been cheating on her, but he had invented a fictional version of her sick, helpless, mentally incompetent to make himself feel better about destroying their marriage. He had turned her into a burden, a tragic figure who deserved abandonment rather than loyalty. He said you didn't even recognize him most days, Sabrina continued, her voice breaking with the kind of desperation that comes from watching carefully constructed illusions crumble in real time. That staying married to you was just an act of charity because you were too sick to take care of yourself. Linda felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. The pain was beyond anger, beyond hurt, reaching into territory she had never explored before. This wasn't just adultery, it was character assassination, the systematic destruction of her identity to service his need for justification. Daniel, Linda said, her voice deadly calm in the way that only comes from moving beyond rage into something more dangerous. Would you like to explain to Sabrina how I managed to book a flight, navigate 2 airports, and track you down across 4,000 miles despite my supposed dementia? Daniel opened his mouth but no words emerged. He looked back and forth between the 2 women like a tennis spectator trying to follow a ball moving too fast to track. His face had gone gray, aged by years in the span of seconds. Sabrina was not finished. The floodgates had opened, and months of accumulated resentment and insecurity came pouring out like water through a broken dam. You promised me you were going to leave her, she said to Daniel, tears beginning to streak her makeup. You said after your anniversary this fall, you'd finally file for divorce and we could be together openly. Their anniversary? Jason stepped forward, his phone capturing every moment of the confrontation for posterity. Dude, their anniversary is next month. You were planning to divorce your wife right after celebrating 38 years of marriage? The timeline made the betrayal even more calculated, more deliberate. Daniel hadn't just been having an affair, he had been planning Linda's abandonment with the methodical precision he usually reserved for legal strategy. You told me she wouldn't stop texting and calling you, Sabrina continued, her voice breaking completely now. You said she was clingy and possessive and made you feel trapped in your own house. I don't text him, Linda said quietly. I see him every morning at the breakfast table. The simplicity of this truth seemed to hit Sabrina like a revelation. She stared at Linda with the expression of someone realizing they had been lied to about everything. Not just the wife's condition but the entire foundation of the relationship. You promised you'd leave her after the anniversary, Sabrina repeated, now crying openly. You said I made you feel young again, like you could start over. Daniel finally found his voice, though it came out cracked and desperate. Sabrina, please, you don't understand the situation. No, you don't understand, Sabrina shouted, her voice cutting across the beach like a siren. She swung her designer tote bag at him, the heavy purse catching him in the shoulder and nearly knocking him off balance. You lied to me about everything. Your wife, your marriage, your plans. Everything. Jason moved quickly to steady Daniel, preventing him from falling backward over his chair. The gesture was automatic, protective, even though Jason was clearly disgusted by what he was witnessing. Linda watched the scene unfold with the strange detachment of someone observing a car accident in slow motion. This was her husband of 37 years, reduced to a pathetic figure being attacked by a woman half his age in front of a cafe full of strangers. The man she had loved, supported, defended, and sacrificed for was cowering behind their son-in-law. While his mistress screamed at him about promises he had made in hotel rooms paid for with their retirement money. She walked up slowly, each step deliberate and measured, until she was close enough to see the panic in Daniel's eyes. Close enough to smell the expensive cologne he had been wearing, cologne she had never seen in their bathroom. Never smelled on his clothes when he came home from his alleged business trips. Linda slapped Daniel across the face with enough force to turn his head and silence the entire cafe. The sound echoed across the sand like a gunshot, sharp and final. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Children paused in their play to stare. Even the ocean seemed to quiet for a moment, as if nature itself were acknowledging the gravity of what had just happened. Daniel touched his cheek, stunned not just by the physical impact but by the realization that his wife, his supposedly helpless, mentally compromised wife, had just delivered judgment in public. Sabrina, Linda said, not taking her eyes off Daniel's face. How long has this been going on? 6 months, Sabrina whispered, her anger deflating into something that looked like shame. He said he'd been unhappy for years. He said you two lived like roommates, that there was no love left between you. 6 months. While Linda worried about grocery budgets and prescription costs. While she sorted mail every Tuesday and balanced their checkbook every Saturday. While she believed they were partners navigating retirement together, building a shared future on the foundation of their shared past. Daniel had been building a different future with a woman who was young enough to be his daughter, using money Linda had helped earn and save over 3 decades of marriage. He said you were just waiting around to die, Sabrina added quietly. That you had given up on life and were just going through the motions. The cruelty of this final revelation felt like a blade sliding between ribs to find the heart. Not only had Daniel betrayed her, but he had described her as already dead, a ghost haunting their house, a burden waiting to be discarded. Daniel broke into sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. I'm sorry, he choked out between gasping breaths. The pressure, the lost cases, feeling old, feeling invisible. When Sabrina showed interest in me, I felt alive again. I felt like the man I used to be. Which man? Linda asked, her voice cutting through his tears like a scalpel. The one who promised to love me in sickness and in health? Or the one who told his girlfriend that I have dementia? She made me feel young, Daniel whispered, as if youth were a drug he had been denied and finally found. Linda looked at her husband, really looked at him for what felt like the first time in months. His hair was thinner than she remembered, more silver than gray. His shoulders sagged with the weight of 70 years and too many disappointing legal cases. His eyes were red with tears and shame and the kind of desperate fear that comes from watching your world collapse. He didn't look young. He looked like an old man who had confused desperation with vitality. Who had mistaken the temporary rush of forbidden romance for a return to youth that was never coming back. Then start over like a young man, Linda said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering sentence. Without my house, my savings, or my name. For the first time in the entire confrontation, Daniel seemed to understand that this wasn't just anger that would eventually cool. This wasn't hurt feelings that could be soothed with apologies and promises. This was the end of their marriage, delivered in front of strangers on a beach in paradise. The realization hit him like a second slap. His sobs grew louder, more desperate, drawing stares from other cafe patrons who had been trying to politely ignore the unfolding drama. Sabrina gathered her beach bag and walked away without another word, her designer sandals clicking against the wooden boardwalk with the staccato rhythm of retreat. She left Daniel alone at the table with lobster rolls growing cold and champagne going flat. Surrounded by the debris of a fantasy that had just exploded in his face. Linda turned to follow Sabrina's path toward the resort parking lot, then stopped and looked back at her husband one more time. He sat hunched in his chair like a broken marionette, tears streaming down his face while other diners pretended not to notice his collapse. "I loved you for 37 years, she said, her voice carrying across the beach with perfect clarity. "Today, I'm finally going to learn how to love myself." She walked away across the sand that had witnessed the end of her marriage. Carrying her purse and her dignity and the terrible freedom that comes from watching illusions die in broad daylight. Behind her, Daniel called her name twice, his voice breaking on the syllables like waves against rocks. But Linda didn't turn around. For the first time in decades, she was walking toward something instead of away from it. Toward a future that belonged entirely to her. Back in Mesa, the desert house felt smaller than Linda remembered, as if the walls had moved closer together during her absence. She drifted through the empty rooms like a ghost revisiting the scenes of her own life. Touching familiar objects that now seemed to belong to someone else's story. The silence was profound, not the comfortable quiet of a shared space temporarily empty, but the hollow silence of abandonment. Even the refrigerator's hum seemed muted, apologetic. As if the appliances themselves understood that the life they had served faithfully for decades was coming to an end. Daniel was still in Hawaii, supposedly, thinking things through, and figuring out his next steps. According to the voicemail he had left on her phone during the flight home. His voice had sounded small and lost, like a child calling for help from the bottom of a well. Linda deleted the message without listening to it completely. She had heard enough of Daniel's explanations to last several lifetimes. She spread 3 decades of documents across her coffee table with the methodical care of an archaeologist examining artifacts from a lost civilization. Mortgage papers, insurance policies, bank statements, tax returns. The paper trail of a marriage that had started with shared dreams and had somehow ended with secret airline tickets to paradise. The oldest documents were yellowed at the edges, brittle with age and handling. Their first mortgage papers from 1987, signed when they bought this house with a VA loan that seemed impossibly generous at the time. Daniel's signature was bold and confident, written with the flourish of a young lawyer who believed the world was his for the taking. Her own handwriting looked smaller beside his, more careful, but both names appeared on every page with equal authority. Back then, they had been partners in the truest sense. Daniel handling the legal complexities while Linda managed the financial details. Both of them working toward the same goals with the synchronized efficiency of a well-rehearsed dance. She remembered that day clearly, walking through this empty house for the first time as owners, planning where to put furniture they couldn't yet afford, dreaming about the children who would play in the backyard and the dinner parties they would host when Daniel's practice grew successful. They had been so young, so certain that love and hard work could overcome any obstacle. The house had felt enormous then, full of possibilities and potential. Now it felt like a museum dedicated to dreams that had died slowly, invisibly, one small disappointment at a time. Linda found their condo investment files from 2008, the scam that had nearly cost them everything. Page after page of contracts Daniel had signed without reading completely. Legal documents that promised guaranteed returns and delivered financial devastation instead. She remembered the sick feeling in her stomach when they realized how much money they had lost. How close they had come to losing the house along with their retirement savings. Daniel had been devastated, convinced that his legal training should have protected them from such an obvious fraud. He had fallen into a depression that lasted months, unable to work, unable to function, barely able to get out of bed most days. Linda had been the one to pick up the pieces. Linda had been the one to figure out how to pay the bills and keep the mortgage current while Daniel recovered from his shame and self-recrimination. At the bottom of the pile, she discovered pay stubs from the diner where she had worked double shifts after Daniel's law practice collapsed. 60-hour weeks serving coffee and hash browns to construction workers and retirees. Her feet swelling in cheap shoes while she calculated tips needed to pay for Daniel's bar exam review courses. He had to retake the exam after his nervous breakdown, and the review courses were expensive, hundreds of dollars they didn't have for a test he had passed easily 20 years earlier. But Linda had worked those extra shifts without complaint, telling herself that marriage meant supporting each other through difficult times. Each pay stub represented 12-hour days that started before dawn and ended after midnight. Her supervisor at the diner, Maria, had been impressed by Linda's work ethic but concerned about her health. "Mija, you're gonna kill yourself for that man," Maria had said during one particularly brutal week. "Make sure he's worth it." At the time, Linda had been certain Daniel was worth any sacrifice. Now, looking at those faded pay stubs, she wondered if Maria had seen something Linda had been too loyal to recognize. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. For 37 years, every financial crisis had followed the same pattern. Daniel made the mistakes, and Linda cleaned up the mess. Daniel took the risks, and Linda absorbed the consequences. Daniel pursued his dreams, and Linda paid the bills. She had told herself this was partnership, that marriage meant supporting each other through difficult times. She had worn her sacrifices like badges of honor, proof of her commitment and loyalty. But looking at these documents spread across her coffee table, Linda saw something different. This was the paper trail of a woman who had carried the weight while her husband collected the credit. She thought about Daniel's mother, Eleanor, during her final days in hospice care 3 years ago. The old woman had been sharp until the end, her mind clear even as her body failed. She had held Linda's hand with surprising strength and whispered words that had seemed merely sentimental at the time. "You carried this family, not my son," Eleanor had said, her voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. "I hope someday he realizes what he had. I hope he appreciates what you gave up for him." Linda had dismissed the comment as the ramblings of a dying woman, overly dramatic in the way that elderly people sometimes became when facing mortality. She had squeezed Eleanor's hand and murmured reassurances about love and commitment and the joy of building a life together. Now Linda understood that Eleanor hadn't been rambling. She had been issuing a warning. Linda organized the documents into 3 careful piles on her dining room table. Each one labeled with a handwritten sign that felt like a declaration of independence. "What I gave, what he took, what I still own." Under "what I gave," she placed 20 years of diner pay stubs. Community college transcripts from the accounting classes she had taken to help manage Daniel's struggling law practice. Hospital bills from her gallbladder surgery that she had postponed for 6 months because they couldn't afford. Both the procedure and Daniel's malpractice insurance renewal. The surgery delay had been Linda's suggestion, made with the calm practicality that had defined most of their financial decisions. "It's not life-threatening," she had told Daniel. "I can wait until things are more stable." She had lived with chronic pain for 6 months, taking over-the-counter medications and lying awake at night while Daniel slept peacefully beside her. Under "what he took," she placed secret credit card charges dating back months before the Hawaii discovery. Hotel receipts from Phoenix. Restaurant bills for expensive dinners on nights when he told Linda he was working late. 6 months' worth of lies told to a 30-year-old girl who believed Linda was suffering from dementia. The restaurant charges were particularly painful. Daniel had been taking Sabrina to places he had never taken Linda, spending money on romantic dinners. While Linda clipped coupons and bought generic groceries to stretch their fixed income. He had been courting another woman with their retirement money while his wife worried about affording prescription medications. Under "what I still own," she placed the house deed with both their names. Her separate savings account that Daniel didn't know about $3,000 accumulated through months of careful budgeting and small sacrifices. Her Social Security benefits that couldn't be touched by divorce proceedings. Her good credit score, earned by 30 years of paying bills on time while Daniel pursued get-rich-quick schemes and risky investments. For the first time since discovering those airline tickets, Linda felt something other than betrayal and rage flowing through her chest. She felt hope. The hope was small and fragile, like a seedling pushing through concrete, but it was real. For 37 years, she had defined herself as half of a couple, as Daniel's wife, as the supporting character in someone else's story. She had measured her worth by her ability to facilitate his dreams, solve his problems, clean up his messes. But looking at the "what I still own" pile, Linda realized that she had been building her own foundation all along without recognizing it. Every responsible financial decision, every sacrifice that protected their future, every careful choice that preserved their security had been her work, her wisdom, her strength. She wasn't just the victim of Daniel's betrayal. She was the architect of whatever came next. Her phone rang with the piercing urgency that always made her heart race. Daniel's name appeared on the caller ID, along with a photo from their last anniversary. Dinner, both of them smiling at the camera like people who had never heard of Hawaii or mistresses or the specific kind of cruelty that came from describing your wife as mentally incompetent to justify abandoning her. Linda let the call go to voicemail, then listened to Daniel's message with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. Linda, sweetheart, please call me back. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But we can work through this. 37 years means something. We can go to counseling. I'll end things with Sabrina completely. Please don't throw away our life together over one mistake. I love you. I've always loved you. Call me back. One mistake. As if 6 months of systematic lying, cheating, and stealing money from their retirement account could be reduced to a momentary lapse in judgment. As if describing your wife as having dementia was just a slip of the tongue. Rather than a carefully constructed lie designed to make infidelity feel like charity. Linda deleted the message and turned off her phone with movements that felt ceremonial. Like blowing out candles on a birthday cake or throwing dirt on a coffin. She walked into their bedroom, her bedroom now, and opened Daniel's closet with the curiosity of an investigator examining evidence. His clothes hung in neat rose navy suits for court appearances, polo shirts for golf, casual shirts for weekend errands. The same wardrobe he had worn for years, now scented with the aftershave she no longer recognized. Behind his hanging clothes, Linda found a shoebox she had never seen before, tucked away behind his winter coats like contraband. Inside were printouts of email exchanges, flight confirmations, restaurant receipts from Phoenix hotels, and photographs of Sabrina that made Linda's stomach turn. The emails revealed an entire secret life that had been growing like cancer. While Linda balanced their legitimate expenses and worried about their financial future. Daniel and Sabrina discussing vacation plans, sharing intimate jokes, planning a future together that involved Linda's complete erasure from Daniel's life. At the bottom of the box, she found a letter Sabrina had written to Daniel after their first weekend together. The handwriting was loopy and young, decorated with heart symbols that would have seemed charming on a teenager's notebook. But looked pathetic on a grown woman's love letter. Danny, last night was incredible. I never thought I could feel this way about someone your age, but you make me forget about the years between us. You're so much more interesting than guys my own age. They're all still figuring out who they are, but you know exactly what you want. When you leave your wife, we can build something real together. Somewhere tropical, maybe. I can't wait to start our life. Love always, S. Linda read the letter twice, absorbing the casual cruelty of its assumptions and the breathtaking naivety of its expectations. Sabrina had genuinely believed that Daniel would abandon his wife for her. That their affair would transform into a legitimate relationship built on love rather than deception. The girl had no idea that men who lie to their wives also lie to their mistresses, that betrayal was a character trait. Rather than a circumstance, that someone who could systematically deceive one woman could just as easily deceive another. Linda carefully placed the letter back in the shoebox and carried the entire collection to her dining room table, adding it to the pile marked, "What he took." This wasn't just evidence of an affair, it was proof of a planned future that Daniel had been building with another woman. While pretending to navigate retirement with his wife. The deception was breathtaking in its scope and duration. This wasn't a midlife crisis or a moment of weakness. This was a systematic plan to abandon his wife and start over with a younger woman, using money Linda had helped earn and save over 3 decades of marriage. That evening, Linda sat in her backyard as the desert sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. The same sunset she and Daniel had watched together from these same chairs for 15 years. Commenting on the beauty of the light and making plans for tomorrow. But tonight, the beauty belonged only to her. She didn't have to share it with someone who had stopped appreciating it years ago. Someone who had been planning to abandon it for tropical sunsets with a woman who called him Danny. The silence felt different too, not lonely, but spacious. Her thoughts could expand without bumping against someone else's mood or needs or hidden agenda. She could sit with her feelings without having to manage anyone else's emotions or defend herself against accusations of paranoia. For the first time in decades, Linda Carter was completely alone. And to her surprise, it felt like freedom. Tomorrow, she would start making phone calls. A divorce attorney, a financial planner, someone who could help her understand exactly what I still own might be worth when divided by Arizona's community property laws. For 37 years, Linda had defined herself as half of a couple. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of discovering what Linda Carter might become when she was only herself. Monday morning found Linda sitting in the parking lot of the Mesa Senior Center at 7:30, a full hour before her appointment with the legal aid attorney. She gripped the steering wheel of her Honda with hands that trembled slightly, staring at the building, where she had volunteered for 3 years without ever imagining she would someday need its services herself. The irony felt sharp and uncomfortable. She had helped organize the legal aid program, posting flyers about free consultations and encouraging other seniors to protect themselves against financial predators. She had served coffee to elderly victims of romance, scams and identity theft, listening to their stories with sympathetic detachment while secretly feeling grateful that such disasters happened to other people. Now she was the other people. Linda pulled down the visor mirror and examined her reflection with the critical eye of a woman preparing for battle. She looked older than she remembered, more fragile, with lines around her eyes that seemed deeper in the harsh morning light. But there was something else in her expression too, a hardness that hadn't been there a week ago, a resolve that came from having nothing left to lose. She carried a purse stuffed with documents that represented the wreckage of her marriage, bank statements, credit card bills, hotel receipts, printed emails, and photographs that Megan had sent from Hawaii. Evidence of betrayal organized with the same care Linda had once applied to Christmas card lists and birthday calendars. The senior center lobby smelled like industrial coffee and disinfectant, familiar scents that usually comforted her but today felt institutional and impersonal. She walked past the bulletin board where she had posted notices about Medicare enrollment and prescription assistance programs, past the meeting room, where she usually taught cooking classes for seniors on fixed incomes. Today, instead of teaching others how to stretch their grocery budgets, she was here to learn how to rebuild her life from the financial ruins of a marriage. A young woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor was setting up a folding table in the conference room, arranging legal pads and case files with efficient precision. She looked barely 30, with the earnest enthusiasm of someone who still believed the legal system could deliver justice to people who deserved it. "Mrs. Carter?" the woman asked, standing to offer a firm handshake. "I'm Sarah Martinez from the Maricopa County Legal Aid Society. Thank you for coming in today." Linda had expected someone older, more experienced, perhaps a battle-scarred veteran of family court wars. But when Linda spread her documents across the table, Sarah's expression shifted from polite professionalism to focused intensity. Her youth didn't seem to matter when faced with evidence this damning. "Tell me about your situation," Sarah said, opening a yellow legal pad and clicking her pen with the sound of ammunition being loaded. Linda had rehearsed this conversation during the sleepless nights since returning from Hawaii. But sitting across from a lawyer in the room where she used to teach retirees how to make affordable casseroles, the words felt surreal. "My husband has been having an affair for 6 months, Linda began, her voice steadier than she felt. "He's been using our retirement money to finance trips to Hawaii with a woman named Sabrina who thinks I have dementia. I found out because my daughter was vacationing in Maui and saw them together on the beach." Sarah wrote quickly, her pen moving across the legal pad with the rapid scratching of someone accustomed to capturing terrible stories in shorthand. She stopped occasionally to ask clarifying questions. How long had they been married? Did they own property together? Were there children involved? What kind of retirement accounts did they share? Each question felt like surgery, exposing the anatomy of a life Linda had thought she understood. 37 years of marriage reduced to legal categories: community property, spousal support, asset division, marital misconduct. "The good news," Sarah said after reviewing Linda's meticulously organized bank statements, "is that you've been very careful with documentation. Arizona is a community property state, which means assets acquired during marriage belong equally to both spouses, regardless of who earned them or whose name is on the account." "Even if he's been lying and stealing from our accounts?" Especially then. Sarah's smile was sharp with professional satisfaction. The court doesn't look kindly on spouses who hide assets or misuse marital funds for extramarital activities. Those Hawaii trips could actually work strongly in your favor during property division. Sarah began explaining concepts Linda had never needed to understand: spousal support calculations, retirement account division formulas, home equity assessments. Each term felt like learning a new language, but Linda found herself surprisingly calm as she absorbed the information. After decades of managing their household finances, legal language felt like a natural extension of skills she already possessed. "What about the house?" Linda asked, thinking of the desert sunsets she watched from her backyard, the kitchen where she had cooked thousands of meals, the bedroom where she had nursed Daniel through pneumonia and celebrated their anniversary every year with breakfast in bed. "You've been making mortgage payments for 33 years, Sarah said, running calculations on her legal pad. "Even if you divorce, you have significant equity built up. The question is whether you want to buy out his share and keep the house, or sell it and split the proceeds." Linda thought about the photographs covering her hallway walls, documenting decades of family celebrations and vacation memories. She thought about the garden she had planted behind the house, the fruit trees she had nurtured through brutal Arizona summers, the careful improvements she had made over the years to turn a simple ranch house into a home. "I want to keep it," she said without hesitation. "Then we'll work toward that goal. But first, we need to protect your immediate interests." That afternoon, Sarah accompanied Linda to a credit union across town from the bank where she and Daniel had maintained their joint accounts for decades. The building was smaller, more intimate than the corporate banking center where Linda had always felt like just another account number. The process of opening an individual checking account felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, like learning to walk after spending years in a wheelchair. Linda signed her name with careful precision, each letter feeling like a declaration of independence. "This is your money now," Sarah explained as Linda completed the paperwork. "Social Security payments, any separate assets you had before marriage, earnings from work you did independently. He can't touch any of it." Linda transferred the money she had been secretly saving for emergencies. $3,000 that represented months of careful budgeting and small sacrifices: generic medications instead of name brands, store-brand groceries instead of familiar labels. Skipped meals out and postponed purchases that might have brought small pleasures to their retirement. Money Daniel didn't know existed, accumulated through a thriftiness he had never appreciated and sacrifices he had never acknowledged. For the first time since discovering those airplane tickets, Linda felt like she had some measure of control over her own destiny. The checking account was small, modest by any standard, but it was entirely hers. Her name only, her decisions only, her future only. "There's something else we need to discuss," Sarah said as they walked back to her car. "Your husband will likely try to contact you, probably with promises to change, offers to go to counseling, threats about what divorce will cost you. It's important that you don't make any decisions based on fear or guilt." Linda thought about Daniel's voicemail, his plea to not throw away our life together over one mistake. The phrase still burned like acid in her chest. "How'd I know if I'm making the right decision?" Linda asked. "Ask yourself this," Sarah replied. "If you found out about this affair but he hadn't been caught, how much longer would it have gone on? If your daughter hadn't been in Hawaii, would he have told you about Sabrina voluntarily?" The questions hit Linda like physical blows. If not for the coincidence of Megan's vacation, Daniel would still be living his double life. Still lying about funeral trips while secretly flying to paradise. Still describing her as mentally incompetent while she balanced their checkbook and managed their household. She would have continued worrying about their retirement security while he spent their money on another woman. She would have continued believing they were partners while he planned to abandon her after their anniversary. "He would have left me," Linda said quietly. "After 38 years of marriage, he would have divorced me for a woman who calls him Danny." "That's your answer," Sarah said. That evening, Linda drove to Daniel's law office in Scottsdale with the same sense of purpose she had felt boarding the plane to Hawaii. The building looked even shabbier in the harsh Arizona sunset, paint peeling around the windows, weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot asphalt. signs of a practice that had been struggling for years while Daniel spent money on vacations instead of professional maintenance. Linda used her key to enter through the back door. The same key Daniel had given her years ago so she could help with filing and bookkeeping during busy periods. She had never used the key for anything except legitimate business, had never violated the trust implicit in having access to his professional space. Tonight felt different. Tonight, she was conducting an investigation. She searched through Daniel's desk drawers with the methodical thoroughness of a forensic accountant. Finding exactly what she expected: more evidence of the secret life he had been building while she balanced their household budget and worried about their future security. Hotel receipts from Phoenix dating back 8 months, long before the Hawaii trips began. Restaurant charges for expensive dinners on nights when he told Linda he was working late on difficult cases. Credit card statements for an account she had never seen before, funded by transfers from their joint retirement account. The paper trail revealed a systematic diversion of their money to support his affair. Money that should have been growing in their retirement accounts instead of funding romantic getaways with a woman young enough to be their daughter. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in an old case file like contraband, she found Daniel's cell phone backup drive. He had always been meticulous about backing up his data. A habit left over from the early days of technology when losing a phone could mean losing months of client contact information. Linda plugged the drive into Daniel's office computer and scrolled through months of text messages between her husband and Sabrina with the same detachment. She might have applied to reading a novel about strangers. The messages told the story of a relationship that had started as flirtation and evolved into elaborate planning for a shared future. Sabrina asking when Daniel would finally leave his sick wife. Daniel promising that after their anniversary, he would file for divorce. And they could be together openly in whatever tropical paradise they chose for their new life. The most painful messages were the ones where Daniel described Linda as a burden he had been carrying out of obligation rather than love. "She doesn't understand me anymore," he had written. "We're like strangers living in the same house. I feel like I'm disappearing a little more every day." Linda had thought they were partners navigating the challenges of retirement together, supporting each other through the ordinary difficulties of aging and reduced income. Daniel had apparently seen her as dead weight he was eager to discard as soon as he found a suitable replacement. She printed the most damaging text exchanges and email correspondence, creating a file that would make any divorce attorney smile with professional satisfaction. Then she went through Daniel's email account, finding correspondence with a real estate agent about investment properties in Phoenix that he had apparently been considering purchasing with Sabrina once he was free from his marriage. The scope of his deception was breathtaking. This wasn't a midlife crisis or a moment of weakness or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was a systematic plan to abandon his wife and start over with a younger woman, using money Linda had helped earn and save over 3 decades of shared sacrifice. By midnight, Linda had filled 2 manila folders with evidence that would make divorce proceedings swift and decisive. She locked Daniel's office and drove home through empty streets, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt powerful, not just angry or hurt or betrayed, but genuinely powerful. For the first time in their marriage, she held all the cards. She had the evidence, the legal representation, the financial planning, and the moral authority that came from being the injured party rather than the perpetrator. The next morning, Daniel called from Hawaii. Linda answered on the 4th ring, surprising herself with her own calm. "I'm flying home tonight," he said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had spent days trying to salvage a fantasy that had exploded in his face. "We need to talk." "Yes, we do," Linda agreed. "I'll be here." But when Daniel returned to find legal documents spread across their dining room table and a divorce attorney's business card taped to the refrigerator, he would discover that the conversation was going to be very different from what he expected. Linda had spent 37 years believing that paperwork was Daniel's domain and love was hers. Now she understood that paperwork was where love was either honored or stolen, where promises were either kept or broken, where the future was either shared or seized by whoever was willing to plan more carefully. And Linda Carter had become very good at planning. 8 weeks later, family court smelled like old coffee and institutional disinfectant. The familiar scent of bureaucracy and broken promises that seemed to permeate every government building Linda had ever entered. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the persistence of trapped insects, casting harsh shadows across rows of wooden benches that had witnessed thousands of marriages ending in a symphony of legal language and bitter recrimination. Linda sat in the gallery with Megan and Jason flanking her like bodyguards, their presence both comforting and surreal. She had never imagined that her children would someday accompany her to divorce court, serving as witnesses to the legal dissolution of the life they had all shared for decades. Daniel paced near the tall windows at the far end of the courtroom, his movements agitated and repetitive like a caged animal seeking escape. His navy suit hung even looser than it had in Hawaii, and the gray in his hair seemed more pronounced under the unforgiving courtroom lights. He had lost weight during the weeks of legal preparation, and his face carried the hollow look of a man who had been forced to confront consequences he had never seriously considered. His attorney, a young man with an expensive haircut, and the kind of aggressive confidence that came from winning cases for clients who could afford his fees, whispered urgently in Daniel's ear. But Daniel kept shaking his head, dismissing advice with the stubborn resistance of someone who still believed he could charm his way out of disaster. Judge Patricia Reynolds entered the courtroom with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had presided over too many marital train wrecks to be shocked by anything she might hear today. She was stern-faced and practical, a woman in her 50s who had apparently seen every variation of human selfishness and disappointment imaginable. Her reputation preceded her through the legal community, fair but impatient with excuses, thorough in her examination of evidence, famous for cutting through legal theatrics to focus on facts. Linda's attorney had warned her that Judge Reynolds showed little sympathy for spouses who squandered marital assets on affairs, regardless of their gender or age. Today, those facts were spread across the judge's bench in neat, damning piles: bank statements showing systematic financial deception, credit card records documenting months of secret expenditures, phone bills revealing hundreds of calls to a number registered to Sabrina Lopez, and printed text messages that chronicled 6 months of planning Linda's abandonment. Mr. Carter, Judge Reynolds said, adjusting her reading glasses with movements that suggested this was going to be a long morning. I've reviewed the evidence presented by your wife's attorney. Would you care to explain the 8 separate charges to various Hawaiian resorts over the past 6 months? Daniel's lawyer whispered something urgent in his ear. But Daniel stood up with the misguided confidence of a man who still believed his charm could overcome documentary evidence. Your Honor, I made terrible mistakes during a difficult period in my life. I was feeling old and irrelevant, struggling with the reality of retirement and reduced income, and I made choices that hurt my family deeply. But I believe Mrs. Carter and I can work through this privately, through counseling and renewed commitment to our marriage, without requiring the court's intervention in our personal affairs. Linda had heard variations of this speech before, delivered in their living room when she confronted him with credit card statements, in their bedroom when she demanded explanations for unexplained absences, over the phone when he called from Hawaii begging for forgiveness. Always the same pattern: acknowledge the behavior while minimizing its significance, accept responsibility while shifting blame to external circumstances, promise change while avoiding specific commitments. It was the same speech he had given during the condo scam investigation in 2008, when his poor judgment had nearly cost them their house. The same essential argument he had made after every failed business venture and questionable financial decision: the mistake was circumstantial. The marriage was salvageable, and time would somehow heal wounds that kept getting deeper. But this time, there was no private space for his explanations. This time, his words were being recorded by a court reporter and evaluated by a judge who dealt with financial deception as part of her daily routine. Mrs. Carter, Judge Reynolds said, turning her attention to Linda with an expression that suggested genuine interest in hearing the other side of this story. Your attorney has filed for dissolution of marriage based on irreconcilable differences, with requests for spousal support and an unequal division of marital property in your favor. Is this your intention? Linda stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 37 years of marriage pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. For decades, her hands had steadied Daniel during every crisis, reached out to comfort him. During every failure, worked to rebuild what he had systematically torn down. Today, those hands rested calmly in her lap. Not reaching for him, not rescuing him, not enabling another cycle of destructive behavior followed by superficial remorse. Yes, Your Honor, it is. The court has reviewed your financial records dating back 10 years, Judge Reynolds continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen these patterns repeated countless times. Mr. Carter, your history of financial irresponsibility is well documented and troubling. The investment losses in 2008 that Mrs. Carter worked double shifts to recover from. The credit card debt in 2015 that was paid down using Mrs. Carter's inheritance from her deceased mother. And now these recent expenditures on extramarital activities that total more than $12,000 over 6 months. The specificity of the judge's recital made Daniel's face flush red with embarrassment and anger. Linda could see him struggling to maintain composure while having his failures catalogued in public. Reduced to line items in a legal proceeding that would become part of the permanent record. Daniel's attorney tried to interrupt, but Judge Reynolds held up her hand with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling her courtroom. Furthermore, the text messages between Mr. Carter and Ms. Sabrina Lopez reveal a deliberate plan to abandon this marriage and start over with marital assets that rightfully belong to both spouses. Mr. Carter, did you discuss purchasing real estate in Phoenix with Ms. Lopez using funds from your joint retirement account? Your Honor, those were just conversations, hypothetical discussions. We never actually. I have emails between you and a Phoenix real estate agent about a condominium purchase scheduled for next month. Judge Reynolds interrupted, reading from the documents spread across her bench. The down payment was to come from a 401k withdrawal that would have triggered significant tax penalties and depleted your joint retirement savings. Were you planning to inform your wife about this withdrawal before completing the transaction? Daniel's face went from red to pale in the span of seconds. His attorney whispered urgently, but Daniel just stared at the floor like a schoolboy caught cheating on an exam. The evidence was overwhelming and methodical, presented with the same careful organization. Linda had applied to household budgets and tax preparations for decades. Every secret expenditure, every hidden plan, every lie told to justify his betrayal was documented and categorized with the precision of a forensic audit. Additionally, Judge Reynolds continued, the court notes that Mr. Carter described his wife to his extramarital partner as suffering from dementia and being unable to manage basic household tasks. These statements appear to have been deliberately false, designed to justify his infidelity by portraying Mrs. Carter as mentally incompetent. The cruelty of this particular deception seemed to resonate even in the sterile environment of family court. Linda heard Megan make a soft sound of outrage from the bench behind her, a reminder that Daniel's lies had hurt more than just his wife. Mrs. Carter, you've requested to retain the marital home and assume full responsibility for the remaining mortgage payments. You've also requested spousal support for 3 years while you rebuild your independent financial foundation. Given Mr. Carter's demonstrated pattern of financial irresponsibility and marital misconduct, the court finds these requests reasonable and proportionate to the circumstances. Linda felt Megan grab her hand and squeeze tightly, transmitting support and encouragement across generations of women who had learned to protect themselves against men who confused selfishness with vitality. Additionally, the court orders Mr. Carter to reimburse the marital estate for funds spent on his extramarital relationship. Hotel bills, airline tickets, restaurant charges, and gifts purchased for Ms. Lopez using marital assets. The total comes to approximately $12,000, which will be deducted from Mr. Carter's share of retirement assets before distribution. Your Honor, Daniel's attorney protested, finally finding an opening to speak. That seems excessive. Judge Reynolds looked up from her papers with the expression of a woman who had heard this argument too many times to find it even mildly interesting. Mr. Carter chose to finance his affair using money that belonged to both spouses, she said, her voice carrying the dry authority of established law. Mrs. Carter should not be required to subsidize her husband's infidelity. The court sees no reason to allow him to profit from marital misconduct at his wife's expense. Then Judge Reynolds delivered the words that would echo in Linda's memory for the rest of her life. A judicial summary that felt like vindication delivered with the weight of legal authority. Today, the court writes in ink what Mrs. Carter's life has been shouting in silence for years. The evidence shows that she carried the financial and emotional weight of this marriage, while her husband pursued his own interests with systematic disregard for their joint welfare. Mr. Carter's pattern of selfishness and deception, culminating in a planned abandonment of his wife after their 38th anniversary, makes reconciliation both unlikely and unwise. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, final and irreversible. The noise echoed through the courtroom like the closing of a massive door, separating Linda's past from her future with the authority of law. Outside the courthouse, Arizona sunshine felt different on Linda's skin, brighter, warmer, as if she were experiencing natural light for the first time in years. Daniel waited on the courthouse steps while Linda gathered her documents and purse, his presence both familiar and foreign. When she emerged into the brilliant desert morning, he was there with the expression of a man who still couldn't quite believe what had happened. His face carried the shock of someone who had expected his charm to overcome evidence, who had believed that decades of marriage would trump months of systematic betrayal. "Linda," he said, his voice breaking like adolescent vocal cords. 37 years. We can start over. I'll do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever you want. I'll never see Sabrina again. Please don't throw away our entire life together." Linda looked at the man who had been her husband since she was 29 years old, who had shared her bed and her dreams and her fears for most of her adult life. The man who had promised to love her in sickness and health while secretly describing her as mentally incompetent to justify abandoning her for a younger woman. "I already did start over," Linda replied, her voice carrying the calm certainty that came from making a decision and accepting its consequences completely. On that witness stand, she walked past him toward Megan's car, carrying her purse and her dignity and the legal documents that made her a free woman. Daniel called her name twice, his voice carrying across the courthouse plaza with the desperation of someone watching his last chance disappear. But Linda didn't turn around. For the first time in decades, she was walking toward a future. Instead of away from one, moving in the direction of her choosing rather than following someone else's lead. Behind her, Daniel stood alone on the courthouse steps, holding the consequences of choices he had made in secret while believing they would never be discovered. Ahead of her, Megan waited by the car with tears of pride and relief streaming down her face. For the first time in 37 years, Linda Carter belonged entirely to herself. 15 months later, Linda stood at the same podium where she had once listened to lectures about Medicare enrollment and prescription assistance programs. But today, the Mesa Senior Center had asked her to be the speaker for their monthly seminar series, and the topic was one she never could have imagined. Discussing publicly, trust, love, and paperwork protecting yourself in late-life relationships. The community room was packed beyond capacity, with folding chairs arranged in rows that stretched nearly to the back wall. 67 women and a handful of men, most of them over 50. All of them carrying the weight of marriages that had lasted decades and the growing suspicion that longevity didn't guarantee loyalty. Linda recognized several faces from her volunteer work: women who had served lunch beside her, men who had helped with computer classes, couples who had seemed perfectly content when she knew them as half of her own couple. Today they looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity, as if she were a survivor returned from a journey they might someday have to take themselves. A year ago, Linda began, her voice carrying easily across the silent room, "I thought I knew what love looked like after 37 years of marriage. I thought it meant trusting completely, supporting unconditionally, and never asking uncomfortable questions about money. Or time or phone calls that ended too quickly when you entered the room." She paused, looking out at the assembled faces. Some nodded with recognition that made her heart ache for them. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps seeing their own relationships reflected in her words and not liking what they saw. "I was wrong about almost everything. Love that requires you to ignore evidence isn't love, it's enabling. Trust that demands blindness isn't trust, it's willful ignorance. And when someone you've trusted for decades starts lying about Hawaii, Vacations and secret credit cards and younger women who call them pet names you've never been allowed to use. Your choice isn't between saving your marriage or destroying it. Linda's voice grew stronger as she continued, drawing confidence from the truth of what she was saying. Your choice is between acknowledging reality or living in denial. Between protecting yourself or pretending that loyalty is the same thing as stupidity. A woman in the front row raised her hand tentatively. Linda recognized her as Margaret from the Wednesday volunteer group. A woman who always spoke about her husband with the kind of forced cheerfulness that suggested trouble beneath the surface. How did you find the courage to actually leave? Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. After so many years together, after building a whole life with someone. How do you throw that away? The question hit Linda in the center of her chest, bringing back memories of the terrified woman who had sat in this same room a year ago. Clutching bank statements and wondering if she was strong enough to rebuild her life at 66. I didn't throw anything away, Linda said, her voice gentle but firm. Daniel had already thrown our marriage away when he decided to plan a future with another woman using our retirement money. I didn't find courage, I found self-respect. And once I found it, I realized I'd been living without it for longer than I wanted to admit. Another hand went up, this time from a man Linda didn't recognize. He was probably 70, wearing a golf shirt and the kind of wedding ring that spoke of decades of marriage. What about forgiveness? He asked. What about the Christian thing to do? My pastor says marriage is for better or worse. Linda had wrestled with this question through countless sleepless nights. Battling the voice in her head that whispered about duty and commitment and the sanctity of marriage vows. It was a voice that sounded suspiciously like her mother, who had stayed married to Linda's father despite his drinking and his gambling and his tendency to disappear for days at a time. For better or worse doesn't mean for deception and betrayal, Linda replied. When my husband was struggling with his law practice, when he lost money in bad investments, when he went through depression after his failures, that was worse. I stayed. I worked double shifts. I used my inheritance to pay our debts. That was honoring our marriage vows. She looked directly at the man who had asked the question, noting the way his wife sat rigidly beside him with eyes that never quite met Linda's. But when he deliberately chose to lie to me, steal from me, and plan to abandon me for another woman? That wasn't. Worse, that was his decision to end our marriage while leaving me to pretend it still existed. After the seminar, Linda stood in the parking lot, answering individual questions from women who had approached her with stories that made her grateful for the relatively clean ending of her own marriage. Husbands who had gambled away pension funds. Wives who had discovered secret families in other states. Partners who had been systematically transferring assets to offshore accounts while claiming they could barely afford groceries. Each story reminded Linda that betrayal came in many forms. But the end result was always the same: the destruction of trust that had taken decades to build and could never be fully repaired. By the time she finished talking to the last questioner, the desert sun was beginning its slow descent toward the mountains that ringed the Phoenix Valley. Linda drove home to her house now, according to the deed that hung framed in her kitchen with only her name printed in bold letters. The mortgage payments were manageable on her combination of Social Security, spousal support, and the part-time bookkeeping work she had taken with a local veterinary clinic. Dr. Jennifer Mills had hired her after the divorce, initially as a favor to help Linda rebuild her financial independence. But the work had turned into something more meaningful than either of them had expected. Linda found genuine satisfaction in helping a young couple build their business. Using skills she had developed during Daniel's lean years to create systems that would support the clinic's growth. She worked 3 days a week, earning money that belonged entirely to her while contributing to something that mattered to people she genuinely liked. The work gave her purpose beyond the legal vindication of her divorce. It reminded her that she had always been competent, organized, and valuable, qualities that her marriage had somehow trained her to forget. She pulled into her driveway as the automatic sprinkler system activated across her front lawn, sending arcs of water across the desert landscaping she had installed after the divorce. Replacing Daniel's expensive grass with native plants had reduced her water bill by 60%. While creating a garden that thrived in Arizona's harsh climate instead of fighting against it. The house felt different now, not smaller, as she had feared, but more spacious. Her morning coffee routine moved at her own pace, uninterrupted by someone else's schedule or mood. The television played programs she actually wanted to watch instead of endless legal dramas and golf tournaments. The kitchen counters stayed exactly as clean as she left them, and the refrigerator contained only food she liked and would actually eat. Living alone had revealed pleasures Linda had forgotten existed: the luxury of reading in bed without disturbing anyone. The freedom to eat dinner at 5 o'clock or 9 o'clock depending on her appetite, the simple joy of decorating for holidays without negotiating someone else's preferences. Some evenings were spent on long phone calls with Megan, who was now 7 months pregnant with her second child. Their conversations had grown deeper and more honest since the divorce, no longer filtered through Linda's need to maintain the facade of a happy marriage. Megan shared her own marriage struggles and parenting challenges with the confidence that her mother would offer support without judgment. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Megan had said during their last call. "Dad's choices hurt all of us, but watching you rebuild your life has taught Emma and this new baby something important about strength." Weekends belonged to family time with Emma, who was now 3 and had appointed herself as Grandma Linda's chief gardening assistant. They spent Saturday mornings planting vegetables in the backyard plot that had replaced Daniel's expensive golf equipment in the garage, Emma chattering about butterflies and bugs, while Linda marveled at how much joy could be found in watching tomatoes grow. Some Saturday afternoons included barbecues with Jason's extended family, gatherings that stretched into desert sunsets and reminded Linda that family could be chosen as well as inherited. Normal conversations about work and weather and children's milestones, freed from the undercurrent of financial worry and marital tension that had colored family events during the final years of her marriage. Daniel had moved to a small apartment in Tempe after selling his law practice to a younger attorney who specialized in personal injury cases. According to the last update Megan had shared, he was working part-time as a paralegal and struggling to make ends meet on his reduced income. The relationship with Sabrina had ended badly within weeks of the Hawaiian confrontation. Apparently, discovering that her boyfriend wasn't the financially secure lawyer she had imagined and that he came with a vengeful ex-wife armed with legal documentation had dampened Sabrina's enthusiasm for their tropical romance. Linda felt no satisfaction in this news. Daniel's failure to build a new life wasn't her victory, it was simply the predictable outcome of choices he had been making for years. She had learned that revenge was less satisfying than freedom, that vindication mattered less than peace. She had kept one manila folder from the divorce proceedings, labeled Hawaii, in her careful handwriting. Inside were copies of the airline tickets, hotel bills, and text messages that had ended her marriage and started her new life. Not as trophies or reminders of pain, but as evidence of her own strength. Evidence that she had been brave enough to face truth when it finally revealed itself. Evidence that love without respect was just habit disguised as devotion. Evidence that starting over at 66 wasn't a tragedy, it was a gift many people never got the chance to unwrap. On warm evenings, Linda sat on her back patio with a book and a glass of wine, watching the desert sky transform from blue to pink to purple above the mountains. The same sunset she had shared with Daniel for 15 years now belonged entirely to her. And the beauty felt different when she didn't have to share it with someone who had stopped appreciating it years ago. Mrs. Patterson from next door often joined her for these sunset sessions, bringing stories from her own widowhood and wisdom about building friendships in retirement. Other women from the senior center had started what they jokingly called the Saturday Afternoon Survivors Club, divorced and widowed women who met for coffee and conversation and the particular freedom that came from answering only to yourself. The group had grown to include 12 regular members, ranging in age from 55 to 82. Each with her own story of love lost and independence found. They shared book recommendations and travel plans and the small victories of women learning to enjoy their own company. Linda's phone buzzed with a text from Emma, sent with Megan's help. "Love you, Grandma. Can we plant sunflowers tomorrow?" She smiled, typing back, "As many as you want, sweetheart. We'll make the whole backyard yellow." Tomorrow would bring another day of choices that belonged entirely to her. What to cook for breakfast, which books to order from the library, how to spend her money, whom to trust, how to love, when to speak and when to remain silent. For the first time in her adult life, Every decision carried only her name, bore only her consequences, served only her interests and the people she chose to include in her carefully constructed new world. The desert wind stirred the wind chimes Daniel had bought her for their 20th anniversary, the only gift from their marriage she had kept, not out of sentimentality but because she liked the sound they made when the evening breeze moved through them. Tonight they played a gentle melody that sounded like forgiveness, not for him, but for herself. For the years she had spent believing that loyalty meant ignorance, that love meant never asking hard questions, that marriage meant accepting less than she deserved. As darkness settled over Mesa, Linda gathered her wine glass and headed inside to the house where every room reflected her taste, her priorities, her careful stewardship of resources that would last as long as she needed them to last. She moved through rooms that belonged entirely to her, past photographs of her real family and furniture chosen for her comfort and books selected for her pleasure. She had loved Daniel for 37 years, giving him the best of her youth and middle age and the beginning of her golden years. But tonight, as she prepared for bed in a room that smelled like her soap and her perfume and her dreams, Linda Carter was finally learning how to love herself. And that felt like the beginning of something beautiful. Life, she had discovered, doesn't end just because it breaks once. Sometimes the breaking is where the real living begins. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. Thank you for